Hello everyone, this is Volker Janssen, your instructor in History 180, and I just wanted to touch base with you now that we have passed week 3 and you are waiting to get grades on your discussion forum and your writing assignment B. Of course, you've also now completed lessons 7 to 9. Lesson 7 still had some written feedback requirements and you have gotten some responses from me and most of your grades are in for that. I cannot speak about the details of that lesson because there are still some who are catching up and I don't want to give away the answers. But I will in time let you know what the full expectations for these lessons were. I have some feedback on the discussion forum. The question, was the Civil War a failure to compromise? Some of you took that question very technically. Was it a failure to compromise? And then if you end up fighting, then you can say yes in the end. Of course, that has to mean that there was no compromise. So yes, maybe more importantly, the question asks you to consider the context of Secretary of State Kelly's, not Secretary of State, Chief of Staff Kelly's answer to that situation, where he described the Civil War as a failure of both sides to compromise and his effort to somehow preserve Confederate war heroes as legitimate patriots. So that really was the important context for this commentary that the Civil War was a failure to compromise. Most of you picked up on that and responded generally with a lot of conviction that in fact slavery was not something that the nation was able to compromise on. Now, some of you couched this with some caution, saying that we shouldn't place modern moral values on the past. But others, I think, made the right point that, for slaves back in the day, slavery was wrong. So it's not like to condemn slavery now is somehow a modern value, and at the time no one would have understood that. In fact, there were plenty of Americans, white and black, who understood slavery to be deeply morally reprehensible. Some of you also made the very important point that in fact slavery had been built on a compromise ever since the founding of the nation. When you read the Declaration of Independence and you read the United States Constitution, can you honestly say that these documents are ambiguous about the morality of slavery, and that somehow slavery fits squarely into a concept of democratic governing participation or a republican form of government, that slavery fits along with the Bill of Rights and the very noble, enlightened declarations in our Declaration of Independence? We all know that there is a deep tension, and it is not just us who discovered this. The founding generation also knew that there was a deep conflict. And so built into the Constitution were 3 tiny little compromises that made slavery possible to continue. That was the 3/5 compromise that let Southerners count slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of apportioning representation in Congress only. These were not 3/5 of a vote. These were ways in which Southern planters expanded their weight in Congress by counting their chattel property. The other compromise was, of course, the Fugitive Slave Act that is already built into the Constitution, or very shortly thereafter was put into the Constitution to allow Southerners to retrieve runaway property, quote unquote. The third compromise that is hidden in the Constitution is a ban on any discussion of a slave importation ban for 20 years, meaning pushing it out to 1808. So these 3 very well hidden points in the Constitution tell us about the founding generation's struggle to build a democratic form of government, to some extent democratic, not entirely, a republican form of self-governance, and at the same time maintain an institution that was so clearly in violation of a lot of the principles that the founding fathers allegedly fought for. And the smarter ones amongst them, including Thomas Jefferson, knew that these conflicts were there. So compromise was built into the nation. It was expanded then, as many of you recognized, with the Missouri Compromise, and then was tried again and again, including the Compromise of 1850. Even Douglas and Lincoln, in their debates, both offered some form of compromise on the issue of slavery. One suggesting popular sovereignty as a means of resolving the issue of freedom versus slavery in Western territories and future states, and Abraham Lincoln suggesting that they just leave slavery where it is and not allow its expansion. That was a compromise that a lot of Northern abolitionists really took him to task for. So Lincoln tried a middle-of-the-road approach that was willing to overlook some of the deep moral issues that were involved with allowing slavery to continue in states like South Carolina or Mississippi. And yet, it still did not work, because the South had no other way than to expand slavery. And despite Southern protests that this was all about states' rights, Lincoln gave them the right to keep slavery as a local institution in their states. And that was not sufficient, because ultimately what Southerners needed was a federal protection and endorsement of the institution of slavery. And this is where all efforts at compromise that had really sort of burdened the nation from its very inception no longer worked, and ultimately had to be abandoned. So did compromise end with the Civil War? Yes. Was this somehow a diplomatic failure, a political failure on the part of Northerners and Southerners, as Kelly implied in his answer? Absolutely not. The reason that slavery continued for so long as it had was that Americans had bent over backwards to accommodate so-called slave powers. And had Kelly understood the particular context of slavery in American history, he would have made that clear. And he would not have said that somehow the Civil War was a failure of people at the time to really sort of find a middle ground. Middle ground had been exactly what they had been searching and trying to accomplish and reach for over 70 years. So that's my feedback on the discussion board. So please keep this in mind as you read any of my responses. As for writing assignment B, I will have to ask you to be patient. I am hoping to have them all graded by the end of tomorrow, and you can then see what you can learn from this writing assignment for the next one, the more important one, the midterm. Okay? I hope you're all working hard on this, but I'll give you the weekend to incorporate any suggestions that I have from writing assignment B, so that the next one that you're working on is even better. Okay? Thank you very much. Keep on working hard, and I'll see you next time.